really Cold War in Asia, starting with decolonization and independence. So World War II undermined a lot of the colonialism of the Europeans, specifically France and Britain, in Africa and Asia. In some cases, it just kind of made it economically unfeasible to have these colonies, and other times they straight up just left those colonies due to invasions from other nations and stuff like that. You also see bolstered nationalist movements. Again, kind of same thing we saw in World War I. Their participation in the war, the colonial subject participation, led to them demanding independence and the colonial empires. So the colonial empires of France and Britain are intact at the end of the war, but they're both starting to crumble. And we started to see it here in Indonesia and Vietnam, where both of them declared independence after Japan surrendered on August 40th, 1945. Japan had invaded both of these countries, these colonies at this point. So once they surrendered, they just declared freedom. And both these are going to lead to wars against their European colonial masters. We see India and Pakistan achieve full independence in 1947 with the British Raj, the British government in the Indian subcontinent, partitioning them into India and Pakistan. Pakistan originally East and West Pakistan, and then Eastern Pakistan becomes Bangladesh. Decolonization is also happening kind of on the whole, right? It's not just these few countries. It creates the new nations of the world, known as the Global South, but also typically more commonly referred to as the Third World. They will become a big force in international affairs as a unit, and also as individual nations in terms of the Soviets and the Americans attempt to kind of court them to their side and become a big battleground for the Cold War. In fact, most of the fighting in the Cold War takes place in these third world countries, and especially in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And for both sides, collapse of the colonial order provides both opportunities and dangers. Probably more opportunities for the Soviet side than the American side. American side, a lot more issues. The U.S. sympathized with a lot of colonial independence, since the United States itself was born from an anti-colonial independence movement. But at the same time, they were aligned with the British and the French, who had the two biggest colonial powers in the world. And in fact, the empires that they had were dependent upon that American aid. The Soviets, of course, Soviet Marxism, of course, supported anti-colonialism. But at the same time, if they're seeing communist independence movements, they're also very concerned about the ideological purity of said communist movements. And so we see decolonization produces a lot of interesting reactions. But we're going to start with Mao Zedong in China, which is not necessarily decolonization. It's more of a civil war going on. So the second pillar of U.S. strategy in Asia, the first, I'm assuming they're saying, is containment. And that stuff was the preservation of China as a strong U.S. ally. China was one of the 5 permanent seats on the UN Security Council that got veto power. And after World War II, we see Civil War return. It first began in 1927, but went on pause due to Japanese invasion during World War II. I'm actually going to flip these around. So that makes more sense to flip those two. There we go. So Japan invaded, and they actually bonded together. They allied the communists and the nationalists. The nationalists led by Chiang Kai-shek, communists led by Mao Zedong, who's a former school teacher. Mao's army survives a lot of Chiang's attacks by utilizing guerrilla warfare, whereas Chiang was using more modern, conventional warfare strategies. On top of that, the long march that the communists took in the 1930s, I believe, gave them a lot of support in rural areas. And by 1948, the communists had seized the advantage, but they were also getting a lot of help from the Soviets in doing so. And so when American officials noticed that the communists were winning in China, they told Truman that the only thing they could do is a full-scale invasion, because they have the nationalists, and Truman didn't want to do that because they were just coming out of the war. And I don't think the activist foreign policy was really acceptable yet in America. And so Mao wins a string of victories and forces Chiang to take refuge on Taiwan. And then in October of 1949, Mao forms the People's Republic of China, short to the PRC, and negotiates a formal alliance with the Soviet Union 2 months later. And so the Chinese Revolution is a big deal because it shifts the balance of power in the Cold War, bringing the world's most populous country into communism, which means that 2/5 of the Security Council is now communist. And then it will eventually see Korea and Vietnam and then other Asian communist movements follow Mao's model. And Mao's victory in China is a stunning blow to Truman. He had already put $2.8 billion into Chiang's government, despite knowing how corrupt it was. It was quite corrupt. And I believe they used the term endemic corruption, which means it's almost like natural to it. Critics in the press and the Republicans in Congress charged that Truman had lost China, making him very sensitive to anybody saying he's too weak on communism, and primed them to commit more money to the next communist challenge in Asia. And that, of course, is going to be Korea. Because just a year later, North Korean communist forces invaded South Korea on June 25th, 1950. And so before we kind of get into the war, let's talk about why it happened. This is all stemming back from World War II, where the Korean Peninsula was liberated from Japan in 1945. The Soviets had occupied north of the 38th parallel, and the Americans occupied south of it. So actually, if the U.S. had never called the Soviet Union in, there's a chance that Korea would have just been fully unified post-World War II, and they didn't really need the Soviets' help that much. Americans occupied south of the 38th parallel. Occupation forces withdraw in 1940 and 1949. Korea remained divided by the 38th parallel, and that was the official boundary. In the north, Kim Il-sung had established what's called the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in the north. He was a communist who had studied in Moscow and had Soviet backing. And in the south, we had Syngman Rhee establish the Republic of Korea. He had studied in New Jersey and, of course, had American backing. Both leaders wanted a unified Korea, which meant that they would have to attack the other one, but neither of them got support from their bigger ally to do that. But we do see Stalin, despite not giving military aid, does advise Il-sung to launch a surprise invasion of June of 1950. And that's what happens, mostly because Stalin is eager to build on Mao's victory in China, the communist spread in China. And he believed that the U.S. would not be willing to go to war in Korea because Korea is strategically not that important for the United States. And so the communists quickly captured Seoul, and South Korea had lost 3/4 of its troops in less than a week, which is disastrous. And U.S., however, against what Stalin had thought, they rapidly mobilized to defend South Korea by taking their troops in Japan and deploying them. And on top of that, they were able to win approval from the Security Council for military intervention. Now, typically, that wouldn't happen. The Soviets would have vetoed it. However, the Soviets were at this point boycotting the United Nations in protest because they had refused to seat the Chinese representatives from the People's Republic of China. Instead, we're still recognizing Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists on Taiwan as the official government of China. UN forces were commanded by Douglas MacArthur, who executed an amphibious landing at I don't know if it's a city, but at Incheon, right here. In September 15th, 1950. His goal here was to flank the North Korean army to pin them below the 38th parallel. So they were already here, right around Busan. So what he did instead is went behind their lines, kind of grabbed all this area, and then kind of tried to trap them on the southern part of the peninsula. So he liberates Seoul, marches into North Korea. Now, he had a different intention than was necessarily wanted out of him. He intended to take control of the whole country and compel an unconditional surrender from Kim Il-sung, which went far beyond his original mandate of simply getting everything back to the 38th parallel or the status quo. So he's very successful, and then China enters the conflict. November, so 2 months after this, November of 1950, China sends 300,000 troops into North Korea and forces the joint U.S.-UN forces to retreat south to the 38th parallel. So you can see here the Chinese forces make their counter-offensive, right? And so eventually what we see this kind of boil down to is U.S. air superiority, bombing by the United States versus the infantry strength of Mao's Red Army and the Soviet military aid. So the Chinese had more troops on the ground, but the U.S. had the ability to try to bomb them into submission. And what we see here is General MacArthur criticizes Truman's management of the war, and he wants to escalate it. He called for direct attacks on mainland China, including the use of nuclear weapons. Truman did not want to do this. He didn't want to escalate the conflict to A and B. He certainly did not want to drop another nuclear bomb. He had a lot of personal weight from when he had dropped it on Japan. He knew how, he knew that the consequences of this could be unknown, so he didn't want to do it. In fact, Truman relieves MacArthur of his command less than a year after he started being in command in April 1951. And then over the next 2 years in Korea, we see a stalemate, mostly because Truman is committed to not making this an unlimited war, right? A war where they're really committing just an insane amount of resources. And they really focused on bombing, which obliterated the North Korean infrastructure and almost destroyed almost all of North Korea's cities, inflicting massive suffering. And in fact, the scale of destruction in North Korea exceeds the damage caused by the Allied bombing campaign against Nazi Germany in World War II, which is pretty remarkable. But also, this strategic bombing did not have the benefit strategically that they hoped it would. Although it will lead to, the economic situation in North Korea that really continues on to this day, or at least be a good part of the reason. We've seen Armistice end fighting July 27th, 1953. So we saw them start June 15th, I believe, right? June 25th, 1950, and it ended July 27th, 1953. So 3 years and a month, 4 years, 50 to 51, 51, 52. 3 years and a month. The thing that really helped end this is Stalin had died. And so after his death 4 months earlier, made peace talks a lot easier. And we see the permanent partition of Korea at the 30th parallel. There's no solution to the Korean Peninsula issue. Obviously, we still have North Korea and South Korea to this day. 36,658 Americans died, 600,000 Chinese died, and 2 million Koreans would die during this war. And this creates a humanitarian crisis here where tens of millions of Koreans face starvation, and we see 100,000 South Korean children become orphans. I'm sure there's a lot more in North Korea as well that we just don't know about. Korean War, very unpopular in the United States, especially as James Michener wrote his novel, The Bridges of Tokori, capturing the ambivalence of U.S. soldiers. They don't really understand why they're there. We're going to see this repeated again in Vietnam. Before Vietnam, the country wasn't really well known in the United States. And so we're going to see this kind of theme of ambivalence by U.S. soldiers continued throughout the Cold War. We also see the general unpopularity of the Korean War leads to Truman's decision to not seek re-election, and which, of course, paves the way for victory of Dwight David Eisenhower, the Republican candidate, the first Republican to win in decades since Warren Harding, 1928. He's a former five-star general and the D-Day organizer and the hero of D-Day. And then they kind of talk about how Korea is a forgotten war, setting a pattern. So it's a forgotten war in that nobody really talks about it, especially in the context when you think about the Vietnam War. Everybody talks about that one a lot more. But it sets a pattern for future Cold War confrontations where the Cold War is going to be a bunch of proxy battles where the Americans and the Soviets, and to a lesser extent other countries, the Chinese, British, and French, will send military aid to stoke local civil wars, but they're avoiding direct confrontation between the major superpowers. And that's going to be for this one. Next time we'll talk about nuclear war and the arms race and stuff like that. But until that one, I will see you. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you